Sea trials have begun of India's first indigenously designed and built aircraft carrier, the medium-class Vikrant, with the expectations of it being fully commissioned sometime in 2022. It's only on being formally commissioned that it will bear the designation INS Vikrant, INS being a short for Indian Naval Ship. The induction of the Vikrant in the making since 1999, when it was first approved on paper, promises to fulfill the Indian Navy's long felt need for a second aircraft carrier as it grows its maritime muscles in the Indian Ocean and beyond. The implications of the Vikrant, not just for India's national security, but how it might begin to even the maritime balance in the region, as well as how its main rival, China, might view it, are explained by Uday Bhaskar, one of India's most respected security, defense, and strategic affairs experts, in an interview with Mayank Chhaya Reports. Uday, a retired Indian Navy Commodore, is a widely published commentator and speaker on a range of defense, security, and strategic affairs issues. Uday Bhaskar.
In the broadest sense, what will the INS Vikrant do for India as a maritime power of consequence?
Well, first of all, Mayank, thank you very much for inviting me onto your show. And a very minor kind of, I would say, correction, if I could put it that way. The Vikrant, which put out to sea on Wednesday, has gone for what we call as the contractor sea trials.
Right.
So it left the Cochin shipyard and is currently undergoing sea trials, which will take a fairly long period. And the prefix of INS, which is Indian Naval Ship, Vikrant,
Right.
would be affixed only when the ship is commissioned. And that would be sometime next year. So as of now, it is still a work in progress. But when it is combat ready and fully operational and it's commissioned, which is to say that it would fly the Indian tricolor as a man of war in the Indian Navy.
Right.
It would have its fighter aircraft on board, because an aircraft carrier derives its credibility from the aircraft it embarks. And this is a combination of fixed wing, that is the fighters, as also the rotary wing, that's the helicopters,
Right.
and the entire surveillance and countermeasure kit that comes with a carrier. So that's, as I said, a work in progress. But when it is fully operational, the new INS Vikrant, if you remember, India acquired the first INS Vikrant in 1961.
Right.
Exactly 60 years ago.
Yeah.
And that is a ship that India acquired from the Royal Navy, the UK. And it served India very well, particularly in the 1971 war for Bangladesh.
Right.
I'm sure you'd remember that, Mike.
I do.
So the new Vikrant, as and when it joins the Indian Navy in a fully operational manner, would bring a very high level of credibility by way of air power, thereby enhancing India's sea power in the Indian Ocean region in the first instance. Because this is a relatively small carrier, about 38,000 tons.
Right.
So one does not want to overinterpret the capability. It will be modest, but it will be credible in demonstrating India's naval capacity and capability in the Indian Ocean region.
Right.
Mike?
Yeah. The carrier was approved in 1999. We are in 2021 and still about a year away from it being combat ready. How might its designers and builders have kept up with the modern gadgetry and weaponry and communication system?
Well, first of all, you're absolutely right. The approval by the government was accorded only in 1999. And that was an acceptance of the Navy's case to induct another carrier, because, as I said, the first INS Vikrant was decommissioned in 1997.
Right.
So there was a gap for India when we did not have a minimum number of 2 aircraft carriers. We believe we need 3, but even at a stretch, 2 carriers are an absolute must. So the Indian Navy had gone to the government and made this case saying that we need to acquire or build an aircraft carrier. And finally, in 1999, it was the Vajpayee government that gave the approval at the cabinet level. And there were a number of delays. Some of it was a resource crunch. The second was that the Navy's own design team found that the original design was for a smaller vessel and that it would not be able to address the operational need. So progressively, the size of the carrier increased, which means that you could embark more aircraft. And by the time we came into the early 2000s, the Vajpayee government had, in a way, brought the program up to a certain point, but they could not take it forward. That's when we had the UPA 1 led by Dr. Manmohan Singh. And that is when I would say the project acquired more traction and funds were made available. And in 2009, the keel was laid in Cochin Shipyard, and the design was more or less finalized. And it was agreed that from the original 20,000 ton carrier or thereabouts, this would be almost double the size. It would be 37,500 tons to be exact. And in the interim, I think to the credit of the team, both the naval design team as also the shipyard, that is the Cochin Shipyard, they were able to, I think, dovetail and accommodate all the changes that were required. And one big decision that was taken was that in the early blueprint, India thought it would have to import steel for the carrier. But a high-level decision was taken that India would find the necessary competence to manufacture that steel in India. Okay. So while it is symbolic, it is creditable that India was able to find the necessary metallurgical competence to be able to manufacture carrier grade steel in the country and use that for what we called as IAC 1, that is the Indian aircraft carrier number 1, which is now christened as the Vikrant. So this is just one example that various items were identified for indigenization, because that was one of the, I would say, objectives in building the Vikrant, that to the extent possible, most items, especially at the lower end of the manufacturing spectrum, would be sourced and identified for being built within India. And we've had some reasonably good, I would say, success there. Almost 350 to 400 medium and small scale enterprises from different parts of the country have been able to contribute in the building of the Vikrant.
I see. For the benefit of my viewers, would you care to explain the actual designing and building of something like this? Does it, I mean, obviously it does not start absolutely from scratch. There is enough material design ideas available across the world. Did we use any of the templates to then build upon it, or we started absolutely?
Yes. I mean, I should not make this out to say that this has been a totally, shall we say, standalone, insulated kind of effort within India. India has benefited from cooperation and interaction with the global shipbuilding industry. Certain countries have been part of the effort for India over the years. Again, to place this in context, India's warship building within India began with what we call as the Leander class of ships, which we had built in tandem with the Royal Navy and UK. So at that time, if you remember in the 70s, it was also a major step for India that the first Leander was built in India to a British design. And progressively, after the Leander class, which was built in India, we embarked on designing warships in India. And the first breakthrough or success was what we call as the Godavari class.
Right.
They represent a certain amount of Indian design. And that was quite, I would say, a learning curve for the Indian ecosystem, which comprised the naval designers who were part of the Navy, the shipyard. In this case, it was the Mazagon Docks, which was the lead yard, and the entire, I would say, Indian private sector that participated. For instance, we had different parts of India, whether it was Walchand Nagar, whether it was Bangalore, Chennai, Hyderabad, who differently added or contributed to the first warship that was designed and built, the Godavari class. Then we scaled up and we moved to what we call as the Delhi and the Brahmaputra class. So today, India has adequate warship design capability, which is very commendable.
Right.
Because if you look at the Indian track record, design has not been a strong point.
True.
And to that extent, for a country that was under sanctions, that had various other, I would say, restrictions, was able to actually move slowly up the ladder and be able to indigenize the design of its frontline warships, which are the guided missile destroyers and cruisers,
Right.
based on that expertise.
Okay.
Where, as I said, we benefited from interacting with the UK, as also with the former Soviet Union, now Russia. And to a certain extent, we did cooperate with West Germany when we were building our submarines. All of this added. And gradually, the level of competence in the Indian ecosystem increased. And we were able to embark upon the aircraft carrier in the late 1990s, early 2000. And again, for the benefit of your viewers, if I could reduce or simplify the whole exercise, when you have a design, the blueprint, like in any, I would say, manufacturing activity, you freeze it or you finalize it after a certain point very broadly. In the case of a ship, we talk about tonnage, we talk about the size of the ship, we talk about the draft and the shape of the vessel.
Right.
In this case, an aircraft carrier is essentially a flat top because it has to embark fighter aircraft.
Absolutely.
Therefore, it has its own inbuilt design requirements. Once that is finalized, which in a way determines the number of aircraft, you could say the rough thumb rule is every 1,000 tons, one aircraft,
Okay.
whether fixed wing or rotary. So
I
therefore,
see.
if we talk about 38,000 tons, we are talking about roughly 36 aircraft that can be embarked.
That's interesting.
Therefore, once you agree on that or once you finalize that, then you lay the keel. That's a big deal. For any ship, whether it's a merchant ship, a crude carrier, a small vessel, an aircraft carrier, the keel is laid. And once the keel is laid, that is really the starting point. So 2009 is the year when we laid the keel for the Vikrant.
Right.
And then over the last decade, the ship was built. We had some setbacks. COVID particularly, I think, was a big, I would say, constraint in terms of the tempo of building activity. But to the credit of the shipyard and the entire team that was designing and helping in the building, I think we were able to bring it to this point of.
Right. But you mentioned the pandemic, but that happened only towards the absolute last phase. So I would like to think that by the time the pandemic hit, we had sufficiently advanced to almost the conclusion level by that time. Wouldn't
No,
we?
you're absolutely right. The keel having been laid, the rest of the superstructure was built.
Right.
So you're right that 80%, I would say, of the superstructure of the ship was built. After that, you have to bring in the propulsion, meaning, okay, you got the structure, it floats.
Right.
But having ensured that the float part has been addressed satisfactorily, which is very important because you can't afford to have any mistakes in the flotation.
Sure. Yeah.
Because that affects the entire, you might say, the life of the ship.
Yeah.
Then you have to ensure that you can move this object, this hull, which means you have to bring in propulsion.
Right.
Gas turbines, the entire, I would say, engine room machinery, the electrical cables. There's almost, a phenomenal, maybe 1,000 kilometers of insulation and cabling that goes into a carrier. Then the entire, workspace, whether it is for the air component or it is for the other parts of the ship. So all of that is added. And what COVID did, my assessment is that it has set you back by about a year plus.
Okay.
Because it was early 2020, you saw the COVID and the lockdown. And as a result, many of the final stage activities had to be put on hold. And then you had to revisit them
True.
after a fairly extended period, which means, many delays and so on and so forth. So that was, to my mind, a major constraint.
Right. Before I get into more serious specifics, slight digression for those who might be interested in pursuing ship designing as a career. Does India offer courses, serious courses for young engineers to get into this specific line of profession?
The answer is yes. We do have a few institutions that provide naval architecture
Okay.
as a course of specialization. As a matter of fact, some of India's better known IITs have a dedicated stream of naval architects. And this, of course, is a small, I would say, capacity. There is a very strong case for India to scale up and invest in shipbuilding as a major activity. And not just the naval architects, but you need every discipline, starting from the welders to the steel cutters to everyone who contributes in their own way. The plumbers, the shipwrights, there's a whole range of activities that go into shipbuilding, and it provides employment. So for years, those of us who have been working in the maritime sector have been urging India to look at shipbuilding as activity that could trigger or catalyze both
Right.
development and various other facets that shipbuilding allows. And history tells us over the last 500 years that every country that has prospered in a short period of time, you will find that they have invested in shipbuilding in a significant way.
Yeah.
And this is true for China as it is for Japan or South Korea and other countries that have benefited by investing in shipbuilding in a sustained manner.
I must point out an irony here. We are particularly good at ship breaking in Gujarat, for instance.
Oh, yes. Yes.
Along shipyard, we are good at breaking things. So I suppose it's time to learn to build it, and which we have with.
No, I must say this, Mayank, now that you mention it, I think the ship breaking industry in Gujarat, in the Alag Yard, is something which is actually a very specialized skill.
It is. Yeah.
And I think over the decades, Gujarat has become a to-go kind of site for all the big ship
Right.
owners of the world. But concurrently, let me just remind ourselves and your viewers that there was a time when Indian shipbuilding was the best in the world.
Absolutely.
This is a little before the colonial phase, when ships built in India, particularly on both the west coast and the east coast,
Right.
and built of Indian teak, were considered to be the best ships for their time.
Right.
It's a pity that India was not able to sustain this, and for this, I think colonization has part of the experience. But we lost that skill somewhere, and I think now there is a very strong case to revive it. And since you spoke about Gujarat, that entire coast from Surat downwards, we had some of the most eminent shipbuilders in the entire Northern Arabian Sea at that time, and their competence was acclaimed from the east coast of Africa all the way down to Kerala, modern Kerala, and they were enabled only by the monsoon winds.
Yeah. In fact, Lothal near Ahmedabad was most likely a dry dock. There are clear signs. Anyway, I digressed. I want to read some figures which you already know, but I want to read it for the benefit of my viewers. This particular carrier is 262 meters long. It is 62 meters at the widest and 59 meters including the superstructure. There are 14 decks in all, including 5 superstructure. The ship has 2,300 compartments. It is designed for a crew of around 1,700, and there are some specialized cabins for women officers. How do these dimensions compare with other aircraft carriers, especially, say, the Chinese one or the American ones?
Well, at this particular tonnage, as I said, 37,500, a little under 38,000 tons, this is a medium-sized carrier. Now, the US Navy operates the largest carriers in the world, and they are nuclear propelled. So there is a completely different kind of design when you talk about nuclear propulsion. And the Indian carrier currently would range somewhere at mid-level.
Okay.
The Chinese have just got into the aircraft carrier business only in this century, literally. India got into the carrier business in 1961. And where the Indian carriers, I think, would rank in terms of the global listing is that they are not in the same league as what the Americans and the former Soviet Union, when it used to have aircraft carriers, for instance, the large ones. That was a completely different kind of, I would say, configuration. Today, the countries in Asia, particularly, which are investing in aircraft carriers, are really China and India in terms of the medium-sized carriers which have fighter aircraft embarked on them. Countries like Japan are investing in large helicopter carriers, which also have their own relevance when you talk about air power at sea. And some of the ASEAN countries, say for instance, Thailand, is also looking at the large helicopter carrier
I see.
as an option. So the lower end of the spectrum, if you look at the United States and the nuclear powered carrier, where we are talking about 80, 90,000 tons, they also embark a larger number of aircraft. India would be somewhere, I would say, at
In the
the
middle there.
middle of the ladder, and we would put the helicopter carriers perhaps at the lower end.
Okay. This is diesel powered, as I understand. Why did we not go for a nuclear reactor?
That's a very expensive proposition. And frankly, at this stage, I think India was not able to go down that path because even investing in a carrier called for a lot of, I would say, fiscal management of the defense budget. Now, we have an anomaly here, which is that if you look at the Indian defense budget, which caters to all three armed forces, that is the Army, the Air Force, and the Navy, the Indian Navy is the equivalent of the Cinderella service,
Right.
meaning that it gets the least allocation, despite the fact that it represents the trans-border military capability of India. The Indian Army is the lead service. Today, we have an army that is more than 1 million strong.
Right.
It receives about 56 to 57% of the overall defense budget. The Indian Air Force, which is the second largest service in terms of numbers, is about 120,000. That receives about 27 to 28% of the budget. So we're already knocking at 80 to 85% of the budget.
Right.
5 to 6% goes for what we call as the defense research and development and the defense public sector. So the Navy is left with a rather modest 13%, 14%. And within that, to be able to find funds for an aircraft carrier, which is a relatively expensive proposition, as also a nuclear submarine.
Yeah.
For the record, India has designed and built its own nuclear submarine. It's called
Right.
the INS Vikrant. Also calls for a certain allocation of funds. So under those constraints, I think India could only do one thing at a time. So it decided to invest in the nuclear boat, that's the submarine, and stick with conventional propulsion, the gas turbine, for the aircraft carrier.
Right. Right. Given that these days, with the click of a button, you can really bring countries to their knees via computer malware, what is the relevance of a behemoth like an aircraft carrier floating around, other than projecting military muscularity?
No, this is a question that's been asked many times, saying that are carriers the equivalent of sitting ducks?
Mhm.
And more recently, because I think in the last 18 months, because of COVID, I think the whole world has become very, very competent and everyone is an expert now. You
Mhm.
give me a subject and give me 5 minutes, I can Google and give you all the available data on any subject. So
Right.
I have met many of the people at various discussions where they actually point out to what happened in Saudi Arabia and what the Houthis did with the drones and what happened in Armenia and asymmetric warfare and how the Chinese are going to bring the Americans to their knees. And, all of this is something that is par for the course when we
Right.
talk about the debate on the aircraft carrier. But there is a professional determination that when we talk about the kind of challenges that a country like India, for instance, would have to deal with in the maritime domain, having an aircraft carrier in the national quiver gives you more options that you will have,
Right.
as opposed to not having an aircraft carrier, which is the equivalent of a floating airfield.
True.
Meaning that with 36 combat aircraft, the Indian Navy, with a fully operational Vikrant, with all the other escorts and support that goes with it, would be able to bring credible air power in a radius of about 400 kilometers in a 24-hour cycle.
Right.
Now, that is a significant capacity in terms of being able to deliver ordnance. Because what does a fighter aircraft do? It delivers ordnance over a target that you have chosen.
True.
Now, why do major countries invest in aircraft carriers? Why is the United States Navy still committed to maintaining 11 aircraft carriers at any given time? Why is China, which got into the game rather late, as recently as 2000, now investing in 5 to 6 carriers over the next decade? So there is a method to the madness that
Right.
when you look at how the maritime domain is to be managed by way of threats that are likely to emerge, sea power can be brought to bear more effectively by an aircraft carrier than, say, hypothetically through a submarine.
Right.
Meaning that a submarine is also a very desirable platform, but it has other characteristics, which an aircraft carrier would, in a way, I would say there's a huge contrast, and the jargon is we talk about submarines for sea denial.
Right.
And we talk about aircraft carriers for sea control. But in the same breath, I would add that technology has now introduced new vulnerabilities. And the possibility that an unmanned aircraft, a drone, a missile could pose a challenge is real. But then those who are in the business of designing and operating aircraft carriers are also ensuring that they have adequate countermeasures.
Right.
So this cat and mouse game, frankly, goes on. And the net determination is that it's better to have an aircraft carrier if you can afford it.
Yeah.
And that's where India is now.
There is a great deal of automation in the Vikrant's machinery operation. That's what I was reading. I'm sure there is a very significant online element to it. How robust is its online security? Can it be, for instance, debilitated remotely?
Again, Mayank, I think we are entering an area of speculation. There is a fair amount of automation because that is where ship design and ship handling is now evolving towards. Can a system that relies on cyber, on automation, can it be hacked? Can it be disrupted? The answer is yes.
Right.
Now, currently, India is going through a conversion in relation to Pegasus.
Sure.
You know all about Pegasus. I think you've done
Yeah.
a chat on that. So the global experience is that we are talking about, say, the American network being hacked by an adversary. We are talking about the possibility of the Chinese having used their cyber capabilities to disrupt certain networks that they had identified. There was concern that Iran's nuclear program had been compromised. So in
Right.
that sense, I think my own assessment as an analyst is that the moment you enter this domain of automation, as also the new technologies that include artificial intelligence, all kinds of, I think, possibilities do emerge. These are exigencies that have to be factored. And I think this is something that would be relevant not just to the Indian Navy and Vikrant, but to all ships at sea,
Right.
as also to all aircraft that are flying anywhere in the world.
Even
I
cars.
think this is something we have. Yeah, cars, absolutely right. So we have to be cognizant of that.
Absolutely, yeah. How does the Vikrant's maximum speed of about 28 knots, I think, compare
Yeah,
with the others in its class?
I think it would be on par for its class. When we say class,
Yeah,
we are talking about size
right.
and we are talking about propulsion. So
Okay.
if you fit an engine of a certain horsepower, it's almost a mathematical calculation that for a
Okay.
given weight, so to that extent, I think it compares reasonably well. Obviously, it would not compare with the nuclear
Right.
powered carriers, which
Right.
are a different kind of ball game altogether. So to
Right.
that extent, I think the current design at least is on par with the current global metric. But of course, much would depend on how the ship is operated, the competence of the crew, and at the end of the day, any ship, whether it's a merchant vessel or a warship, what matters is the professionalism of the crew
Right.
and how they are able to use whatever be the machinery that
Yeah.
is on that ship.
Right. With the Vikrant and the Vikramaditya, India now has two aircraft carriers. You pointed out earlier that we need a minimum of three. Given that, is that sufficient for a country that is peninsular? Just number two.
Well, I would say no. But these days there is such a huge debate about the carriers and whether or
Mhm.
not India is doing the right thing. And I've also added to this debate saying that when we talk about India's composite military capability that would be relevant, say, in 2050, we're talking about 30 years from now, technology is altering the entire military domain in a very, very rapid and radical manner.
Right.
So there are questions being asked by experts now saying that the next war, will it be fought with tanks and fighter aircraft and aircraft carriers and ships at sea and submarines? Or would it be a completely different kind of adversarial interaction?
Right.
And that the asymmetry would be affected not by ordnance, but by capabilities like cyber,
Right.
electronic warfare, hacking, disrupting networks, and what in the jargon is called as spectrum dominance,
Right.
artificial intelligence, robotics. There are all kinds of new things that are happening. Unmanned, platforms, whether they are submersibles or in the air or even on land, and a kind of hybrid warfare where you introduce asymmetry by using technology to leapfrog the
Right.
equivalent of delivering bombs and ordnance and precision guided munitions. So this is a completely new area, and what is called as, you can have warfare without contact.
Yeah.
We've seen many examples of this.
Right. Right.
And I think this is likely to become more dominant in terms of choices. And that is where, even though the geography of India might dictate, and you can create a compelling case to say India needs 5 aircraft carriers. But I'm also aware that India has a very limited budget. So if I had to make a choice between more aircraft carriers or more artificial intelligence or more satellites
You would do the
or more
latter.
space-based capabilities, my current thinking is that I would veer towards higher levels of technology
Right.
and take a chance by perhaps making do with a lesser investment in the tanks and the
Right.
artillery guns and the fighter aircraft. But this is my
Yeah.
personal view. There are wiser minds who are looking at this all over the world in terms of how militaries should rewire.
Yeah, but the simple point is one of the primary objectives of all these capabilities is to physically destroy infrastructure of the adversary, right? Now that can be done, like I said, with a click of a computer button.
Yeah, yeah.
So
As opposed to physically destroy, Mayank, just one thought for you to consider. It is a bit like saying that you want to render the adversary's capabilities ineffective.
exactly.
You
So
can
that
do
can
that
be done
without
without,
physical destruction also,
yeah, so that can be
meaning
done
that,
without the aircraft carrier or any of
yeah, yeah,
the
exactly.
old-fashioned
Yeah.
weaponry.
It's a bit like saying the US Navy currently is an armed force that relies heavily on network centric linkages,
Right.
from the ship on the surface to the submarine to the aircraft to the satellite to the ops room, wherever it is, whether it's in Hawaii or any other part of the US military lattice.
Right.
It's all heavily networked. Now, if you are an adversary and you are planning to deal with the Chinese, with the Americans in an asymmetric manner,
Right.
then hypothetically, if I was a Chinese admiral, I would think of many innovative ways of using technology to stun the adversary and disrupt all the networks. You can do it hypothetically for a task force. If you
Right.
have a carrier task force, it is possible, at least on paper, to introduce the kind of cyber dominance whereby without contact, without the use of ordnance, you can render the network ineffective. So
Absolutely.
that's what I mean by saying physical destruction need not necessarily be an objective.
Right. And to conclude on a slightly broader strategic note, an area that you specialize in, how do you think the Chinese would look at something like the Vikrant and the second one, which is the Vishal, which is coming up, and it's a nuclear-powered one, I'm told. What do you think the China is thinking at this point?
Well, China would definitely be monitoring India's naval capabilities carefully because that is a professional compulsion. In as much as the Indian planners would be studying Chinese maritime
Right.
capability. But, there is a very interesting kind of, I would say, characteristic here. Neither India nor China are natural maritime powers.
Yeah.
They are, countries that are invested in their armies, their whole strategic culture, in terms of the military orientation has been in the land forces. Their greatest anxiety has been about territoriality along the border.
Right.
India and China, even as we speak, are currently in a very tense standoff in the Ladakh sector.
Right.
And historically, since 1962 onwards, territoriality in relation to land has been, I think, a very deep-seated anxiety. For China, it is even more so than India.
Yeah.
The unification of China, Taiwan, issues like Hong Kong, Tibet are really, I think, at the heart of China's insecurity. And it's deep concern that there is a global conspiracy to encourage what they call as splitism. That's a very odd word, but they introduce it, splitism. Not that India doesn't have its own anxieties. India's own grapple with Jammu and Kashmir is reflective of that particular orientation. So to that extent, I think India and China are now aspiring to become maritime powers, but it has not come to them naturally.
Mhm.
But now, of course, they are learning on the curve.
Right.
And my sense is that over the next 50 years, this entire spectrum, the Indo-Pacific, is going to become very animated. And one can only hope that for the next generation, that it would lead to a competitive but not confrontational kind of engagement between Asia's two giants, which
Right.
is China and India.
On that note, Uday, I want to thank you very much for your time. We have, I think, about approaching 40 minutes. It's getting late for you. But one last bit, what was the total cost on the Vikrant? Do you have any numbers?
To be honest, at this point, I really don't have a response on that, but I promise you that I will find the figure and I'll make sure I send it to you because I don't have an accurate answer on that.
No, fine. Fair enough. Thank you so much and good night. I'll send you the links, etc. Pretty soon.
Not at all. As always, Mayank, you do a great show. So thank you very much for inviting me.
That's very generous of you to say. You're always very generous to me. Thank you, Uday.
All the best.
All the best to you and good night. Good night.